Hello, and welcome to the SIG cluster lifecycle meeting for Tuesday, July 17th, 2018. Today, we're going to start off talking about OS images support. So, Cha, you have the first agenda item. Do you want to give a little background?
Yeah. So someone was asking about when the release was going to support more than just Xenial. It looks like in the release repo, we only have debs defined for one particular version of Ubuntu. And they were just asking if we had planned support for the future. I'm not really sure what the state, I'm not really sure how packaging works in Ubuntu. So anybody who knows that would probably have better ideas. I don't know if anyone had any thoughts, if that's something we want to support or.
This request was made for upstream containers too as well, from my understanding, that they were wanted to uprev the actual containers that were published with inside of the repository. So I don't know who actually owns that, but
Okay.
I don't think there's a problem with pushing the change. I don't know if we should own some of that release. It's almost like a release artifact, if that should be pushed to SIG release.
Yeah, there would be a lot of duplication, I think, and the build system is already kind of split into multiple places. Okay, I can talk with release maybe and see if that's something that they're willing to do.
I don't know if there's an owner. The problem with a lot of the SIG release stuff is you toss a ball up in the air and then you watch it hit the ground. Mm-hmm. I don't know if there's anyone there to own that change.
Gotcha.
And I don't know how we get it onto the priority queue for that SIG to manage and own.
Okay. For now, I just make a ticket then to say that's something we're interested in doing, but not sure how to proceed from.
I would make it in the main repository because it affects all those artifacts too as well. I believe I can dig up the issue. I know that there was one logged a while ago regarding this too as well.
Okay, that sounds good. Great. I'll make an issue, put it in the notes, and then you can add your thing to it, Tim.
Cool. So next, I put a little FYI on here about the kube-deploy repository. A long time ago when we first created this repository, the idea was to make it sort of akin to the contrib repository for Kubernetes for cluster deployer code. And that doesn't seem like it's necessarily working out great for the contrib repository. And I don't think as a SIG we want to support dumping ground for random bits of automation for cluster deployment either. So last night, I removed the cluster API code since it had been moved to its own repository. And there was no reason to keep it in two places. People were sending cleanup PRs for it in the old location, which nobody was looking at. And that left only one thing in kube-deploy, which is the image builder, which is used by cops. So I sent a PR this morning to promote that to the top level of the repo and was talking with Justin about just renaming the repo from kube-deploy to image builder or something along those lines. Or cops image builder, so that it sort of becomes a single-purpose repository. I think as a community, we're trying to move more towards single-purpose repositories instead of multi-purpose repositories with strange ownership. So I just wanted to give an FYI that was the plan, and that's the direction I'm moving it in, and make sure nobody had any objections or questions about that direction.
To be, just for the record, it was always confusing to a lot of consumers what kube-deploy actually was.
Yeah, and for a long time it had a lot of code that was not being maintained, which we ripped out when we started putting the cluster API code there. And basically the only thing in there that was actively being used was the image builder. So I think it became sort of a place for people to stick stuff and then never come back to it, which is also something the SIG doesn't support.
I don't know if you can hear me, but I was just going to say it may be that we end up making that like an AWS, SIG AWS project as well. So it might be that the kube-deploy repo just goes away entirely and we just move that. But yeah, certainly on board with it like cleaning it up.
Yeah, I definitely think we should rename it to be something that actually describes what it does, right? The PR I sent you this morning, Justin, puts the README at the top level, just describing the image builder project, like moving it up one. So if it makes more sense to have, say, AWS own that, then that would be great. Although I did see some like GCE files in there also, so I'm not sure how AWS specific the bulk of the code is.
Yeah, it's what it is building a generic image that is used or suitable for use on AWS. It is used by COPS by default, but it could be used by any AWS distro, and it also can build on GCE, and it actually uses the official Debian image builder, so it can actually build on anything. So yeah, maybe we should just leave it where it is and I'll just do a rename.
Yeah, I mean, you might also take an action item to go sync with the folks that are working on Wardroom, because it sounds like, at least conceptually, it has some overlap with maybe what they're trying to do.
Yeah, and I think I think Wardroom, last time I looked, used Packer, so that's a no-go.
It does use Packer.
Yeah, so like we rejected that for security reasons. Like it's just not appropriate for images that we distribute. It's fine for people using internally, but it's not really secure enough for this use case.
Okay, that's good to know. I was just, conceptually, it seems like they're very similar, like build images for Kubernetes for AWS or GCP, right? So as long as there are good technical reasons why they shouldn't be sort of combined, then that's fine. Cool. All right, next, transfer of ownership.
Yes. At the cluster API meeting, I think it was a couple of weeks ago, we discussed having a AWS provider implementation. I created a skeleton repository and kind of jumped the gun a little bit with the request process. Coming back today to kind of vote on the, as a SIG on trying to get kind of the skeleton implementation transferred over so that we can start kind of collaborating with all the stakeholders that have kind of independently built AWS implementations so that we can kind of come together and build a common implementation for the community.
+1. This sounds great to me. I was just looking at your repo briefly before the meeting, and it looked like the owner's files hadn't maybe finished getting updated.
It should be as of a few minutes ago.
Okay, I still see Count SpongeBob in. Oh, I guess he is a SIG AWS lead. Never mind. I was thinking that was a silly name placeholder, but that's actually a real person in there.
Yes, that's a real person. The only changes that were made were to the specifically to the cluster API AWS maintainers. I made sure that David Watson was on there from Samsung, Nishi from Amazon, and a couple of Red Hatters were added on there as well, since as far as I can tell, those are all of the kind of existing provider implementers so far. If there's anybody else, I'm happy to add them to the list as well.
What are you looking for from this group to move forward? Anything in specific, or are you just kind of giving FYI that it's happening?
Technically, there, from a steering committee perspective, there needs to be a vote with, was it lazy consensus? So if folks +1, as long as there's no -1s, then we just go, right?
All right, I would propose we use Zoom chat to vote. So please either abstain or put a +1 or -1 in Zoom chat, and we will consider that our official vote. And then we'll circle back to that in a couple of minutes to give people time to do that. And Tim, do you want to say something about the sig-charter?
Yes, now that we've kind of rallied on the template and have examples of canonical ones that we consider to be relatively good, sig-node and sig-auth are the examples. We should start to craft a sig cluster lifecycle charter. And I'm looking for folks who would want to help with that effort. I do think that as a SIG lead, I should probably help too. My time is limited though. So if there are other folks who would like to help craft that, I'm happy to work on it together with anybody else.
Is there a template for the charters?
Yes, the template is there, and there's examples of ones that we approve from a steering committee perspective of these are good examples that we should be following and try to apply towards the rest of the community.
Do we have a tracking issue for this as well?
We do not. We should probably create one.
I'm going to create one and probably like use Google Docs for this and let people start editing there.
That sounds great.
Yeah, I volunteered to help work on this as well last week. But Luber, I'd be happy for you to get it kicked off, and we'll start hacking on the shared doc. That'd be great.
Okay. And then we can, maybe next week we can review. Does that sound reasonable?
I mean, I'm going to create it probably today. And I'm still not very clear on what has to be added in the sig-charter, so I need some research for this first.
Sure. I can send you the links to the locations.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and we have some background here also. Justin Santa Barbara wrote up the proposed SIG mission about a year ago, probably, that we can steal some stuff from. We've been sort of presenting that vision at the introduction sessions at the last couple of KubeCons. I think we have a reasonable sort of idea of scope and so forth to stick in there once the template's in place. So I think getting the first pass won't be too bad, and then it'll be sort of iterating on the details and the edges where we define the boundaries of our scope, which is probably worth discussing next week. So I think it's reasonable what Tim proposed to try and get that first pass done before the meeting next week.
Okay.
All right, Tim, state of testing.
So yes, this has resulted in many sort of interrupt-driven issues that have occurred across several release cycles, and I'm sick of it. So for many cycles, we have talked about the ideal world that we would want to get to. Everything's built from Bazel and from the main repository. We no longer have a release repository. We're using Cluster API to provision because Kubernetes anywhere is a dead end, right? We want to have well-defined jobs, maybe even a PR blocking job for kubeadm deployments. And we have put off these issues, and we have kept maintaining this large corpus of technical debt. And it becomes an albatross for anyone new to the SIG, because it is very difficult to understand why and how it's structured, and why some of these issues occur and exist, because of the split, because of the history and all the other stuff that's there. So there are some blocking items for us to make progress. One of which that we wanted to do was we wanted to get Cluster API as the provisioning tool, because that is something that this SIG maintains, and we could have folks that we could poke when there are issues on provisioning aspects. To put it bluntly, we want to have a throat to choke, right? So that way, when issues arise, we can find those people. Because right now, some of the issues are not clear. The second part is release artifacts, right? And build artifacts, and who owns and maintains those. Like, we need to have canonical ownership of those artifacts if we are going to be responsible for some of that detail. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we've always punted off these things. And at some point in time, which I'm declaring bankruptcy, right? We need to start to address them, but not just within one organization. We need to address them broadly as a SIG, right? I know in the past, Google took a lot of ownership stake in this, but in order to fix this problem, it needs to be federated amongst many stakeholders, right? To make sure that we actually solve this problem and address the concerns for the broader ecosystem. So I'll pause there for a moment and see if other folks concur, what thoughts they have on it, et cetera.
I was talking to someone today about this, the problem from last night, I guess. And I don't understand why we should maintain like cloud provider specific tests. to my understanding, with the cluster API, we can move like the ownership of these tests to cloud providers. And if all the cloud providers fail, then this is a kubeadm issue. That's how I see it. And maybe that's not how it's going to work.
That is a broader problem because then the cloud providers would have to support like federated periodic testing, right? Most of there needs to be like a gating signal. We need to have like, ideally we would have some level of PR gating signal. I think the issue that Chuck faced with the other PR is that it was a periodic signal that triggered it, not a gating PR signal. So you had false positive on entry, right? So we need to get some level of gating kubeadm signal in place, right? That could be GCP specific. I don't care, right? Like if Google's invested to get their cluster API implementation and they want to own that level of testing infrastructure, that makes perfect sense, right? To get that automation in place. But the broader federated testing problem is something that we need to solve from a cloud provider. I don't think it falls on this SIG's venue. It falls underneath SIG provider, which is the newly formed SIG. Go ahead, Dims.
Yeah. So I think as a baseline that you were talking about, which gives the thumbs up, thumbs down, we need pre-provisioned things, not cluster API things. So where there is a guarantee from the test infra that, okay, these things are these VMs or whatever container within containers are provisioned and these are ready for you to use. And then things don't change underneath, right? As much as possible. And that is what we would test kubeadm with for a go, no-go signal on the PRs themselves. Then there would be the second level where we would use cluster API and then do GC, OpenStack or whatever, vSphere. That would be like the second level. That is what we should aim for. I think I don't think we should aim for like first go to cluster API and then there is no guarantees there either. Like I was talking to Chuck that if you are not installing some stuff, there are scripts in cluster API also where when the VM starts up, there's a script that runs a bunch of things, and then if we have to maintain it in our side, I don't think that is fair. So I think we need two levels. The first level is something where we know things are up and running, and then we test with kubeadm. And then the second level would be, we can do what we are doing now. Instead of Kubernetes anywhere, we can use cluster API for that.
I think we're in violent agreement.
Okay, good.
And just adding from some testing over here, I think the cluster API stuff looks really cool, and I like the idea of having more like federated cloud providers. I do think for testing, we should kind of wait and see how that pans out. There's a lot more moving parts, particularly with the whole like pivoting from a local bootstrap cluster thing that I think are going to cause some interesting issues in CI.
Yeah, I part of my push for CRDs was broader than just the local problem. It sounds like, in general, I don't think, for my general take on this, and people tell me if I'm wrong, is that this is a good idea that we should do. But we need firm commitments to make things go, right? Heptio has plunked down a lot of resources in SIG cluster lifecycle. And we have done a lot of work in this area, but we also need help, right? Like there needs to be a commitment from other companies to try and help drive some of the pieces of this puzzle through to fruition, right?
Yeah, to that point, it's been on my list for a while to start deleting the cluster directory from Kubernetes. And we've been making slow progress towards doing that. Mike Denise and I spent some time a couple of release cycles ago, like ripping out all of the old unmaintained code, ripping out a bunch of providers that were no longer being maintained. We're sort of culling it down to just the stuff that we actually needed to run EDs. And the next step after that, like you said, is to start replacing that with the cluster API. So it's on my list for this release cycle to try and start that process, like get the first one or two EDEs running on top of the cluster API. I think it might be a little ambitious to try and get everything off for the next release cycle, but I think we can start moving things off. And I think
how close are we to that, Robert?
I don't know. I haven't tried yet. I think Ben had a couple of interesting points. Like the way that cluster cuddle is implemented right now with Minikube, I don't know that that's going to work at all in CI. So, we need to get some miles just running it over and over and over and make sure that it's as reliable as the kube code is right now. And then B, we need to make sure that it can actually run in a CI environment.
Right. That's like the long-term, looking at it from the long-term side, right? So once we have that, then we can rip out Kubernetes anywhere. But then, Ben, is there stuff that we can do right now from the other side where there is pre-provision stuff where we can run kubeadm?
Well, we might be able to patch up Kubernetes anywhere. I need a better idea of like how it's trying to obtain the builds. We might be able to work something with that. I don't know if we really have any other great options besides waiting for a new provisioner to come along.
Yeah, I think Dim's the thing that you're describing, which is that the test infra gives us VMs that are ready to go. I mean, that's basically what we used Kubernetes Anywhere for. Like Kubernetes Anywhere was the part that went to GCP and said, give me VMs, and then initialize those VMs so it was ready to run kubeadmin. And the cluster API does something similar where it talks to GCP and creates the VMs and runs the bootstrapping script, which in this case actually runs kubeadmin, but could just get the VM set up to run kubeadmin. So I think, putting it on SIG, testing to give us a system that will provision VMs and have them ready to go might be a little bit much to ask, right? In some ways, that's what we're supposed to be building.
Yeah, I would agree with. Sorry, I'd agree with that and give like a shout out to SIG testing, who have actually I didn't realize this initially, and like they have been wonderful at reviewing the PRs that I have sent to them and helping me figure things out. But it is our job to send them the PRs for what we want testing to look like, and they are facilitators for that, and they are great at that.
Right, Tim, do you have something?
I think it's possible to get the blocking job for a localized single node kubeadm setup in place. I think there might be some little hoops to get done there, but I think it'd be possible and would give us better signal before we get into some of these issues where periodic jobs give us bad signal later on, right? And if we had single node deployments, it doesn't need to be a multi-node provisioning. That might be beneficial for us to hijack the machine that it's running on to make it introspectively look like it's running on, it looks like it's running on provisioned infrastructure, even though it's like just hijacking the machine it's running on.
Right. So basically, it need not be virtual machines themselves, like Robert was saying. We are right now. We have a few options in test infra where we are running containers within containers. So the single node could be part of that, right, Ben? We do have a E2A running in DIND environment right now.
Yeah, I'm actually probably going to be coming back to the SIG later this quarter, discussing that some more. I am kind of exploring what we have there some more for the local solutions, because that's something that we can manage really well and deflake really well. It avoids more things going out over the network, and everything that goes out over the network flakes.
There is a part of the testing commons effort has been to provide that abstraction layer, and we've been talking about it for a long time, and we have it's very, very rough and very early days, but the idea was just to provide an abstraction boundary for us to be able to write tests against that would do the pseudo provisioning, for lack of a better word, for a test cluster that is kubeadm based, which would be the whole long-term arc of this was that people want to create controllers or their integration pieces, and they want to leverage a localized environment that pre-provisions something that looks like a kubeadm built cluster without them having to go through and actually do provisioning, because that can be very expensive if you're doing it in CI. So that's the long-term arc of what we've been doing there, but we are nowhere near ready for prime time.
Yeah, from a SIG testing point of view, I am looking at the existing solutions. I'm iterating a little bit on something Quentin had built previously. We're very interested in having the local option as just like some coverage, and that might help. But longer term, I think we still need like actual cloud providers. There's a lot of other things that happen there that don't happen in a local solution.
Yeah, I think you need both. That's the layering that Dims was talking about, and I totally agree with. Anytime people turn on their cameras, I think that they want to talk. So, Jason, you turn on your camera.
Well, I was just going to say the biggest pain from my perspective right now is just trying to reproduce test failures. You know, not being able to actually reproduce it, you know, without, you know, waiting for the next triggered run is quite painful right now, and having to create a local environment that, you know, can even run the tests in some cases is, you know, on a kubeadm deployed cluster is very painful right now.
We hear that.
But Ben, can we trigger CI jobs on demand too, right? It doesn't have to wait for the, if it's like a really block everything world scenario, then we could get your help to launch.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible. There's not super great UX for it, for like, say, like just a random community member to do it. But like, the tests themselves are basically a CRD requesting testing to happen. I can just like submit a CRD to like do the test directly to
There's one other meta problem I want to address here, at least why we have everybody in the SIG talking about this, is that the signal gets raised from release, and everyone gets priority level interrupted, you know, right when it's the most critical urgent time. Could we send an email to the SIG whenever things have been, you know, consistently failing as part of some time interval, so that way we can do it?
Yes, TestGrid has some limited support for this now. We just need somewhere to send it.
Yes, you can send it to the SIG mailing list, and everyone on this call will get that signal, right?
Okay, I think the biggest thing there is just like figuring out what's the right level for it to trigger, and it would be great if someone from the SIG submitted the PR. We don't want to like forcibly subscribe people to email spam.
If you can show me where to go to, then I will send up spam filters to go to Justin Santa Barbara's email inbox, and we'll be ready to go.
Sure. There's some comments in the SIG Slack already.
Yeah, if you do want to send that to the SIG mailing list, we should definitely send it to the mailing list plus something or another so people can easily filter it. And it also might start a conversation about whether the mailing list is for humans or for automation. Because I know internally at Google, we have that conversation a lot when mailing lists start to get busy.
I've been discussing some with Aaron Krickenberger, SpiffXP, about potentially reusing or creating some like per SIG mailing lists just for this, so that a smaller subset of members that are actually paying attention to these failures can subscribe and unsubscribe as they want. In the meantime, you can set multiple emails, so you can just add like your email, I want this, and you can add a plus something and filter it.
I was going to ask, so then what is the SIG cluster lifecycle test failures mailing list for?
So I had looked at reusing that. Currently, that's actually there's this GitHub alias. It's like Kubernetes SIG testing test failures. It's like a team on GitHub. And the mentions of that team get reiterated to that mailing list, but they're not in much use. There's just some discussion of should we reuse that mailing list, or should we just get rid of those and create a new one just for like this test failure stuff that's actually test failure automation and not humans pinging people.
Yeah, to give a little background of where that came from, Lumir, when we created our SIG, there was a SIG template that we were supposed to follow, which created a whole bunch of GitHub groups and then a whole bunch of Google groups that backed those GitHub groups. And the idea was that you could add people to the GitHub groups and they get notifications if they were @mentioned, or people could go add themselves to the Google groups without having to be part of the GitHub org, and they could still get notifications. The Google groups also serve as an archive of all of those notifications. This was supposed to be a consistent pattern across all SIGs, so it'd be easy to pull people from other SIGs into conversations. So if SIG testing saw a test failure, they could pull in, just that GitHub group and not all of SIG cluster lifecycle. Similar, there's one for PR reviews and API reviews, et cetera, for each SIG. But I think there's been some conversation recently about how these groups are not really being used very well. I'm not sure we should reuse that group unless we, as a community, decide to sort of deprecate all of those GitHub groups and Google groups behind them.
Yeah, I wasn't subscribed to this particular group, and I think that, I mean, if you decide not to reuse it for the CI signal, I think it's okay, but we have to figure another location for, like, a mailing location.
Yeah, I mean, I've been starting to reach out and see if anyone's interested in that. But in the short term, if you want something now, you can subscribe yourself and just sort of have a mailing list inline to the test grid config. Longer term, I'd really like just this to be a standard thing. SIGs have one where they get automation alerts and people can subscribe and unsubscribe as they want.
Tim, what do you think about sending it to the SIG mailing list for now? And we'll see what the volume is and if people complain. I mean, I think that's going to hit the widest audience and also maybe be the most encouragement for people to fix things. And then if we see if that volume is too high or if we see some patterns emerge across SIGs, we can put it somewhere else.
Sounds good to me.
You can also tune a bit like how quick it is to email, but I think that's like per job right now. So like if you still want a faster signal, you'll just need to send it somewhere else.
I'm only primarily concerned with the blocking jobs, which are periodic, so they should be less annoying than the PR jobs. So.
Yeah, I only subscribe to a few PR jobs where it's like after 10 failures, and we don't really encourage that sort of thing. But I would encourage.
Oh, sorry, Ben. I was going to say that I think that the goal here is also to like get a signal. If something's been broken for a week, we want to know. We don't want to wait until the release comes out and then we get notified. 2 months later, right? So it doesn't have to notify on the first test failure. It could be a little bit lazier than that and still get us the information we need much faster than it is today.
Sure. Yeah, that's totally configurable. You just have to figure out what number you want.
Awesome. Anything else for that one, Tim, or should we move on?
I'm good.
Awesome. So next, this is just a follow-up to last week where we talked about having some SIG sessions at the upcoming Kubecons. I signed up our SIG for an intro and a cluster API deep dive in Seattle, and Tim signed up for a kubeadm deep dive in Seattle. So far, we don't have anybody who's volunteered to run intro or deep dive session in China. So I also wanted to put the call out if somebody does want to run a session in China, we can give you some material to present if anybody knows that they're going and wants to sign up. I think the deadline for that is coming up relatively soon. Otherwise, we hope to hear back that our sessions have been accepted for Seattle.
So we have one active contributor from China, Dixu, I think. But the problem is that he never joins these meetings, mostly because of the time zone difference. So maybe if I send him an email and if I know where to direct him to, maybe we can get him to present.
If he's interested, that would be great. If you could reach out and gauge his interest level, that would be awesome, especially if he's not in this meeting.
I'm just gonna tell him to email you if he's interested.
That'd be perfect. All right, next we have an update about kubeadmin, Docker and Docker cluster.
Yeah, thanks. As this project is in Kubernetes 6 and is owned by sig-charter Lifecycle, I think it may be interesting for some about the update. The important news is that kubeadm-dind-cluster now supports Kubernetes 1.11. I mean, there's pre-built image, and it works not just when building Kubernetes from source. Also, there was a problem with current Kubernetes master. It was noticed by Lucas, and it was using older kubeadm config version. It's now fixed, so you can use kubeadm-dind-cluster with Kubernetes master again. And an important feature that was kind of attempted at the start of the year is now again in the works. It was contributed by by other people, not by me. It's multiple cluster support. So kubeadm-dind-cluster will be able to run multiple test clusters on the same Docker engine. So this may be quite useful for some testing scenarios. That's it about the update.
Awesome. Thank you for the update. And with that update, we've reached the end of the agenda. Does anyone else have something they'd like to add? Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you everyone for coming. We'll give you back 20 minutes of your day today. And if you, like Tim, who's waving, has action items to follow up on, please go ahead and get started on those. I'll see everybody next week or tomorrow. Take care.
Good day.